Disclaimer. Although no vulgar language was used in this video, the lack of profanities is well compensated for by the absolute futility of its content.
Today we're going to be recording about trust, guilt. Saying trust, otherwise. Well, I have my notes here. We agreed that today we're going to prepare for today. So my first question to you guys is, Weavy, have you done any research, any homework in preparation for this?
I've done some, not as much as I would have liked, of course.
Tony?
Thought about it a bit, but I didn't do any research.
Okay, wonderful. This is a wonderful way to start.
No, we're supposed to not really dig in too deep, mostly be spontaneous stuff.
I couldn't help myself. I was researching just a little bit, but in the west end of Scotland, there is a botanic garden. And Weavy, you like botanic gardens?
I do.
Yes. But this one has a characteristic. It's called the Glasgow Botanic Gardens. And it features glass houses, houses made of glass. The most notable of these glass houses, mainly because of its size, is called the Keble Palace. It's a palace made of glass. Inside the palace, there's a statue that was sculpted by a guy named Edwin Roscoe Mullins in 1899. And the statue shows Cain from the Bible. Abel and Cain, Cain, the brother that killed the brother.
Mm-hmm.
The sculpture is called Cain, also known as My Punishment is Greater Than I Can Bear. That is directly from the Genesis in the Bible, Genesis 4:13. Now, Weavy and I have something in common. We're Hispanic. There's a quote that I read today that spoke or rang true to my upbringing and my heritage with a Hispanic crazy mother. The quote says, "My mom doesn't just enjoy the guilt trips. She runs the entire travel agency." Weavy, we didn't prepare this, right? We didn't talk beforehand.
Nope, we didn't.
What do Hispanic mothers say? When do they say you'll be sorry? Once they are what?
Once they're proven right, I guess.
No, once they're dead.
Oh, really?
Hispanic
Oh,
mothers say, one day when I'm dead, you're going to lament that you were like that to me. Hispanic mothers are professionals at organizing guilt trips for their children, right? And so
that they are.
yeah,
Even though I almost think we can say most mothers are pretty good at guilt trips on their children.
yeah. Hispanic mothers have a PhD, and all other mothers have like a bachelor's degree.
You know, you hear a lot about Jewish guilt.
Yeah,
Do try to make you feel guilty about something or other.
so today's topic is going to be about guilt. Okay.
Something that most people have felt at some point in their lives.
Yeah.
Except sociopaths, I guess, right? They don't feel guilt.
And we'll talk about that too. You know, it's a subject that, as most this, you know, this is one of the main 5 videos for season 2. And so I like to start by reading a definition that I found to be more encompassing of the word guilt. Guilt is a moral, emotional state where we experience conflict at having done something that we believe we should not have done, or conversely, having not done something that we believe we should have done. And that's an interesting definition because it has 2 areas of guilt. We can either feel guilty for having done something that we shouldn't have done morally, but
we
also,
regret.
yeah, we can also feel guilty about not having done something that we should have done.
And we didn't do.
Right? Martin Luther King Jr., I think it was, who said something along the lines of, in certain contexts, silence is betrayal. When you see injustice, for example, right? But the key word there is, it's moral.
I mean, so far, I think it fits pretty, it defines it pretty well. I think it's accurate. I mean, either feel guilty for doing something or not.
Yeah, and now I started thinking about what do shrinks, psychologists, say about guilt. And the biggest one, the earliest one in the field of psychology is good old Sigmund Freud, who snorted a bunch of cocaine and didn't feel guilty about it. Freud describes guilt as the result of a struggle between the ego and the superego, mainly through parental imprinting. To understand what Freud says, you have to understand the three energies that fuel personality, according to Freud. It's the id, which is the primal impulse, common to all animals, the impulse to want to get things done now, whether it be having sexual intercourse, eating, drinking. It's basically an urge with legs. And then is the development of the ego, which is the ambassador between the id, or the urges, and the external world. So basically the ego is an enabler of the id, saying, I hear you, I know you want this desperately bad right now, but there's a way of doing it so that you don't get turned down.
Without you, they're just worthless hunks of plastic, like a loaded M16 without a trained Marine to pull the trigger. And in the case of the telephone, it's up to each and every one of you, my highly trained Stratonites, my killers who will not take no for an answer, my fucking warriors who will not hang up the phone until their client either buys or fucking dies!
And then there's a superego. According to Freud, the superego is what we learn from our parents to be morally right or morally wrong.
And Harry, Jimmy, Trent, wherever you are out there, fuck you too.
If what we do as adults is in line with what our parents told us, then we feel rewarded, we feel good. But if it goes against what our parents taught us to be right and wrong morally, we feel something called guilt.
The pendulum of the mind swings between sense and nonsense, not between right and wrong.
That makes sense.
I beg your pardon?
Freud says it's a result of a struggle between the ego and the superego. All the guilt is a species of anxiety, where shame is the result of anxiety. Therefore, according to Freud, anxiety will be considered first, then guilt, and then shame.
What was the first one? Anxiety?
Anxiety, then comes guilt, and then comes shame, in that order. Freud said that guilt is a species of anxiety, a derivation of anxiety, and that shame is a result of anxiety. So one is a type of anxiety, the other one is a result of anxiety.
And ladies and gentlemen of the jury, my client, the Honorable Henry T. Fleming, should go right to fucking jail. The son of a bitch is guilty.
Freud also believed that the primary sources of guilt were fear of authority and the fear of the loss of parental love, which eventually became one's conscience. So according to Freud, we are afraid, we feel guilty because we're afraid to lose our parental love and approval because we're doing something that violates what our parents taught us to be morally right or morally wrong. This is a definition that benefits civilization, right? Because without guilt, civilization will go to
All right, everybody do whatever they want.
Yeah. Another psychologist, Alice Miller, says something that is identical almost. She says, guilt is the sense of not having lived up to our parents' expectations. The difference is between Freud and Miller is that Freud says that we did something that violated what our parents told us was morally right, where she says that we just didn't live up to our parents' expectations.
What about society's expectation?
Well, that's
Why
different.
should it be all completely on the parents?
right? Because that has to do with shame. The implications of these two definitions provided by Freud and Miller is that there's no argument that can overcome these guilty feelings because they're rooted in something with very early beginnings in your life. Meaning, if you go with what Freud says, you're the audience member, you're listening to us. Hopefully one person is watching us and they say, okay, what are the implications of this idea that guilt comes from feeling that we violated something that our parents told us was morally right or wrong, but that goes against our parental expectations of us. That is very difficult to stop these feelings of guilt when somebody comes up and says to a person who feels guilty, oh, you don't have to feel guilty. That doesn't help much because these, according to these two definitions, guilt is formed very early on in a child's development of their personality, right?
So in other words, walking around feeling guilty about everything?
Well, no, not everything, only about those things that violate what our parents told us was right or wrong.
You know, maybe a little later I'll get into a story where I started telling you guys about it last week, where I remember a situation where I was extremely, I gotta admit, I feel like I rarely feel guilt because I always try to do the right thing, right? But I do recall being young, and one day I went to the store with my mother, and we were shopping for school supplies, and I found I don't even know why I took it, but it was a little black phone book. And for some reason I wanted it. And even weirder, I didn't want to ask for it. I wanted to steal it.
Go ahead, Bart. Take it about the store. The store? She's so rich. She'll never notice.
It's the company's fault for making you want it so much.
Don't do it, son. How's that game gonna help your putting?
Just take it. Take it, take it, take it, take it, take it. Take it.
So I took it, which is, again, it doesn't make sense. It must have been, what, $1? I mean, nothing. So I took the phone book, I put it in my pocket. A few minutes later, a security guard actually caught me. And he grabs me and he goes, let's find your mother. And when we found my mother, the security guard tells my mother, listen, your son stole this book and my mother let him have it. I mean, you want to talk about guilt. She probably gave this guy guilt. I mean, she goes, nope, my son would never do that. And she started berating the security guard in front of everybody in a crowded store. And in the end, the security guard said, oh, I'm sorry. And he walked away. And though my mother never asked me, and I never admitted that guilt, I felt extremely guilty because here my mother was defending me. I mean, not defending, she defended me. And she was getting ready to fight this guy. But the guy was right and my mother was wrong.
Your mother is from what country?
She is Dominican.
So anybody Hispanic watching us knows that what Weavy is saying is true. A Dominican mother will physically fight someone when it comes to the job. Yeah.
When they get angry about something, right? And I think that's what made me feel more guilty about it. It wasn't as much about she was wrong. She was unopposed in her belief that I could never have done that.
Guilty because you caused her to lie, actually.
Right. Well, I mean, she didn't lie as far as she knew, because I never admitted this to her. And, she's passed away.
Trying to find out if it was true.
Right. But, I think the fact that she never swayed in her belief that I could not have possibly have done that.
You didn't put it back either, did you?
I don't believe I did. Because at that point, I mean, I was in front of her. So it was like, oh, no.
No reparations made. Okay. But
where does the shame come in?
That's what we're getting at now.
Okay.
There's a difference between guilt in the Freudian notion of the way, which is what Tony's challenging, right? Tony's saying, is everything having to do with the parents, right? Which is based on internal conflicts. Internal meaning your recall of your upbringing, and what a philosopher named Martin Bauer refers to as existential guilt, which is based on actual harm done to others. So existential guilt will be how if Weavy continued to be a thief over time, he will have guilt about the actual harm done to others through his mere existence. Whereas the Freudian sense of guilt is a guilt that is deep within us internally from our understanding of what our parents said was right or wrong. Now, here's the difference between guilt and shame. Those of you who sadly watch our videos to extract some form of direction in your life, which I definitely don't recommend, this is a moment where you can take something away. Guilt and shame have key differences that should not be overlooked. The primary difference between shame and guilt is the source that creates the emotion. Shame arises from a real or imagined negative perception coming from others. It's more social. I feel ashamed when I think of how you think of me. Somebody wrote, shame can almost be described as looking at yourself unfavorably through the eyes of others. When I think of how Tony thinks of me, I feel ashamed. When Weavy thinks about how his mother thinks of him at that time, he felt ashamed. Whereas guilt arises from a negative perception of one's own thoughts and actions.
I thought I'd be jumping for joy the day Skinner left, but now all I have is this weird hot feeling in the back of my head.
That's guilt. You feel guilty because your stud wound up costing a man his job.
Yeah, I guess it is guilt.
Psychoanalyst Helen B. Lewis stated that the experience of shame is directly about the self, which is the focus of the evaluation. In guilt, the self is not the central object of negative attention, but rather the thing done that is the focus. So with guilt, you feel bad about the action, but with shame, you feel bad about yourself.
It seems to me, with shame, you feel what others are thinking of you.
Correct.
Whereas guilt, you're just feeling it based on your own perception, whether your parents,
right or wrong.
What your parents taught you or what society taught you.
Right.
Shame is because you're afraid other people are aware of what you did.
Right.
Or you could be of what other people what you did, or if other people were to find out what you did.
Ah, good.
I would think that would lead to shame as well.
The theory of false guilt says that it doesn't matter if it's true or not, so long as you feel guilty about something, it doesn't really matter because it's internal. Now, an individual can still have a positive perception of themselves while also feeling guilty for certain actions or thoughts that they took part in.
Yes.
Contrary to guilt, however, shame has a more inclusive focus on the individual as a whole. I always say feeling guilty is fine, but don't feel shame. Shame, I think, is way more insidious. It's more about the way you see yourself as an individual, whereas guilt has more to do with feeling bad about something, an action.
And you know what? I like to interject a little bit if you can, because one of the things I wanted to research, I think I had also shared, I have a good friend of mine, and this friend is always telling me of things that doesn't matter whether he did it or he didn't do it. And it doesn't matter if it was purposely done, but he feels guilty. So he feels guilty for performing an action, lives with his wife, of course, or he feels guilty for not being able to, but because of the perception that he should have done something. And I always find it interesting because a lot of times I go, dude, guilt is, I feel sometimes guilt is a little bit, overdone. Like if you couldn't do it and it wasn't within your that you could have taken care of that action or performed that action, you shouldn't feel that guilty about it if you've done everything you can, but he still feels that way. And it's actually funny. And I'm going to make sure he watches this because today I made him feel a little bit guilty because I spent a lot of extra time working on something that I gave to him, and he wasn't able to complete his end of it today because he ran into, a lot of things, right?
I've done that to you, Weavy.
Yeah, well, not even, to be quite honest, not as bad as this turned out. So what happened, and to his defense, they haven't had AC in the house for 6 days, and he's had to work and do all these things. And since early today, I was like, hey, are you going to have that done today? And I can tell he gets upset, and he was kind of upset. And he was like, dude, you're stressing me out. And I go, all I asked is whether you are going to get it done or not. I just want to prepare. And I can tell he's already feeling guilty about it. He doesn't admit he's guilty. He's feeling guilty about it. But you could tell he's physically upset, probably more at himself than at me. But then this is how it comes out. He's just upset. He's feeling guilty, but he couldn't have done anything about it.
Maybe he feels shame because suggested that he didn't do something that he could have done.
That's what I'm saying, Tony. I think that we're so used to using only the word guilt, but we don't use the word shame as much. Mainly because we know the connotation is so much more severe than guilt. You can be found guilty about a crime, but be shameless about it. And that takes us to the idea of lack of guilt in psychopath.
And speaking of shameless, I don't know, have either of you gentlemen ever seen that Showtime show Shameless? That is an excellent example of someone with no guilt and that is completely shameless. One of the main characters in it, the father, completely selfish, doesn't care about his family, will do literally anything to just satisfy his own needs.
Frank, what's your blood type?
O positive. Why?
That's my blood type.
Really? What a coincidence.
Or Dexter.
Dexter's a little interesting because you can tell that in his own way, he's trying to justify it by saying he's doing good, right?
Get me out of here!
Yell all you want, no one's gonna hear you.
Fuck! 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 Fuck!
Feels good.
Fuck!
In Shameless, the father, he's not doing good. He's just doing whatever's convenient to him.
To him. And that's what the definition of shame, right? Shameless is when you look it up.
Right. And if you guys ever want to laugh so hard at the concept of shamelessness, that is a pretty good show.
The question is, you can feel guilty about something that's, you know definitely what it is. Like, you didn't do something, or you did it, or you did do something specifically. You feel guilty. But what about the feeling of guilt when you haven't done anything? In general, you're feeling guilty. Maybe it's something from your parents' background or something, but there's a whole different thing. How do you treat a feeling of guilt when you haven't really done anything? Feel that way.
There's a philosopher, a psychologist named Les Perot. He talked about the disease of false guilt. And the person said, at the root of false guilt is the idea that what you feel must be true. If you feel guilty, you must be guilty. The fact that we feel guilty, this is good for the audience to know. The fact that we feel guilty about something doesn't necessarily imply truthfulness in that feeling. It doesn't really mean that we're actually guilty of that. We could take on the responsibility for somebody else's guilt. One of the many things, the defenses that Freud talked about against feelings of guilt, according to Freud, when we do something that violates or goes directly against our parents' moral code, one way of defending ourselves is through projection. And projection means making other people around us feel guilty for how we feel, for our actions. What happens when we feel guilty about something that we should not feel guilty about?
That's what I mean, yeah.
Right, and
how do you get rid of that?
Well, can you? If it's think about it, since most of the time guilt is usually self-inflicted. You know, yes, we may have the occasion with a spouse or a parent that may try to flame the guilt, but a lot of times guilt can definitely also be self-inflicted. You know, how many times have we heard the story or seen a movie where, you know, something like, oh, I couldn't make it there in time and that person got hurt, or something happened to the child because you weren't able to pick them up on time. You know what I mean? Just something that you had no control over, but we would probably still manage to feel guilty about it. You know, and I know that happens a lot.
It is from your action, although if you were trying to help somebody and you didn't get there in time. It would be if you just left late and you were careless, you'd have a right to feel guilty. If for some reason there was a traffic tie-up and you couldn't make it on time, it wouldn't be your fault. You might feel guilty anyway, but that's a case where it was not your fault.
Or like Juan said at the beginning, what about the opposite? Maybe you ignored something like, I'm sure this has happened to everybody. Oh, I better get my tires checked. And now a day that you needed to do something, a tire blows, or, something happens to your car. And sometimes we would feel guilty. You know what? I knew I should have taken the car to get checked and I didn't.
but you understand that what you will experience guilt about will not necessarily be the tires going flat. It will be that your procrastination goes against the moral code that your parents established for yourself, saying, we shall not procrastinate.
I have one more question I wanted to throw out to you guys, which is, can you have guilt without shame and shame without guilt?
I think they're so intertwined. You can be found guilty of murdering someone and not feel guilty, right? And not feel shame. I think that there are two derivatives. According to Freud, who I think knew a thing or two about how the human mind works, first we experience anxiety, then we experience guilt, and then shame, in that order. The way he explains that is, we do something stupid that goes against what our parents told us was right or wrong. We experience anxiety, then we realize consciously and subconsciously that the reason we're anxious is because we feel guilty, and we feel guilty because we have just kicked our conscience in the balls by doing something that went against what our parents told us was right or wrong. And then we internalize that into shame, meaning through our parents' eyes, we don't feel too great. We could not make a video about guilt without mentioning the Bible. Guilt in the Christian Bible is not merely an emotional state, but it's a legal state of deserving punishment. The Hebrew Bible does not have a unique word for guilt, but the Christian Bible does, and it's called sin. And we're supposed to repent for it. And somebody gave his life for our guilt, for our sins, so that when we are in his company, when he comes back the second time around, we should not feel guilt. Somebody defined guilt as the gift that keeps on giving. I have two questions and a closing quote. Is guilt bad altogether? Is there reparation without guilt? And then there's a quote that I will leave to our audience. If anyone is experiencing any type of guilt out there, it might as well be a poem. The quote is by Debbie Ford, and it says, "An exciting and inspiring future awaits you beyond the noise in your mind, beyond the guilt, doubt, fear, shame, insecurity, and heaviness of the past that you carry around." The message being, perhaps, if you're stuck in life and you're unable to move forward, you need to work on nuking your sense of guilt, your feelings of guilt, identifying what those are and doing what Tony suggested. Remember that guilt seems to be indiscriminate, and regardless of its veracity, it tends to linger longer than most emotional states.
Feeling guilty could lead to something better if you don't want to feel guilty for the same type of thing in the future. You could learn from your mistakes. In that sense, guilt could be a good thing, not a bad thing.
If you're experiencing guilt of any kind, you can say, this is the first stepping stone towards change, which is the very acknowledgement that I want to make a change. Like Tony said, to make this feeling go away. Shame is historically contextual. Shame can almost be described as looking at yourself unfavorably through the eyes of others. Looking at yourself unfavorably through the eyes of others. Well, back in the days, if a woman wore a skirt above the knees and she looked at herself through the eyes of the men at the time, she may have felt shame. Does it mean that wearing a skirt above the knees was something shameful? So it is linked to the outside, the external, societal, political, right? whereas guilt is more internal, based on our idea of right and wrong from conception, from our upbringing.
I guess you could also feel shame without feeling guilt, in a sense. For example, and I was thinking of a specific example, like sometimes you see people that may feel shameful of letting people know that they're poor or that they don't have means.
Correct.
So I find it hard to believe that they feel guilty about being poor, but they are shameful about letting other people know that they're poor.
That's a wonderful distinction that you draw, maybe.
Yes, it was. I didn't think of that.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
You've impressed us all tonight.
Only once?
No, tonight.
I'm kidding.
Let this be the beginning of something great.
Sure, that's what we're hoping for, right?
I didn't feel guilty about not looking anything up.
I know you didn't. You never have. And I don't think you ever will. And that's why I love you just the way you are, Tony.